From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. Folks, thank you, as always, for tuning in. Today's episode, heads up, is going to be a bit of a bummer. So breathe deep and explore it with us. This is an important story. If you'd like to hear something a little less heavy, we totally understand. Check out our recent cryptid episodes. Particularly like to recommend the Mystery of the Thunderbird. But today we're talking about a genuine conspiracy, not a conspiracy theory, and it's a very old conspiracy. It's multi-generational. It ranges across the planet. It doesn't really know any borders at this point. It is a conspiracy that has likely directly affected you in some way already, and it may well affect you in the future. None of this can be taken for medical advice, but we've talked about this off air and agree it is a story that needs to be told. Welcome to Asbestos. Here are the facts. First off, we've all heard the phrase, but what is asbestos exactly? It's something that I think a lot of people, we don't know the specifics about it.
We're going to do as best as we can, though, to describe it to you. Sorry, I stole that joke from D News. But it's true. Asbestos is there was a time where it was considered a wonder material. It is a kind of fibrous silicate material that is naturally occurring, interestingly enough. And it occurs in 6 different types, and it's very, very old. We have evidence of it dating far back in history, and we'll get into that. But for most of human history, asbestos was known for its high heat resistance. It's also waterproof and largely indestructible. You can find multiple examples of the stuff in the ancient world. There were stories of these quote unquote napkins that could be cleaned by literally setting them on fire, and tossing them into an open fire.
Yeah. It's a silicate mineral specifically. So you'll hear in advertisements of years gone by, you'll hear it being called a miracle rock, or something like that. And it's somewhere between, its natural forms can be adapted and revised so it can function as a powder. It can function as it'll look like a bunch of string. You may associate it with the way that insulation looks because it's used in insulation. I love that you're bringing up the napkin story because there are multiple examples in the ancient world of there was this flex that wealthy people in Persia were known to do. You'd eat a meal with a guest and then you would be like, hold my beer, watch this. And you would take your dirty napkin, you throw it in the fireplace. And when the fire was out, you take it out and you're like, oh, look at my clean napkin. This is what being rich is like.
What are you, the king of France? You can just set your napkins on fire? No, it's true. It's neat, too, because you can have it as a solid, and then you can apply heat to it and literally stretch it out. And it becomes this almost makes me think of Phloem or something, or one of those what is that stuff, oobleck, where it goes from one state to another depending on the conditions. So it's something that you can actually kind of almost do a little magic trick with to impress your guests.
It's similar in that way to a non-Newtonian fluid, the stuff that doesn't obey the usual rules of viscosity. You've probably had an experiment with that, or maybe your kids have had an experiment with that in school, folks. It's true. People knew about this stuff for thousands of years, and for thousands of years, everybody was basically like the excited person on an infomercial going, oh my God, I can't believe it's that easy. Now fire is no longer our enemy. Charlemagne had a tablecloth made of asbestos. Marco Polo even claims, historians believe he ran into an asbestos mine. He called it salamander, which is a way cooler name based on, the old idea of salamanders being animals that were immune to fire. we mentioned the heat resistance. We mentioned the water resistance. It's a poor conductor of electricity, which, didn't matter at the beginning of human history, but became progressively more important as technology evolved. But the big question is, what does it do? Like, it would be rare to go to a store even back at the height of asbestos popularity and just buy straight up asbestos as by itself, so like we need to understand what the public liked about it and how it became so common.
And that's the thing. I mean, asbestos was largely used as an additive to strengthen things and make them more fireproof. The large-scale asbestos industry started around the mid-19th century, and it became hugely popular. By the end of the 19th century, it was used in everything. I think I saw a stat that said there were thousands of products that had asbestos in them. Everything from concrete and bricks to cement and pipe insulation, drywall and roofing, anything that you wanted to make stronger and more resilient to the elements. And again, fireproofing, that was asbestos was your guy.
And it made clear sense to do this because people generally don't like buildings on fire. And the list, actually, I cut the list down because it was in so very many things that were often invisible to the average person. You wouldn't walk into a building and automatically be able to tell something had that you were walking on concrete that had asbestos as a filler, or that asbestos had been sprayed maybe on the walls. It was able to provide all the benefits it had as a natural substance, and people were not wrong when they called it a miracle. It's not hyperbole, is what I'm saying, to say that this stuff was everywhere. Like Wizard of Oz, for example. You could call asbestos one of the supporting actors in Wizard of Oz. All that fake snow, pure asbestos. The witch's broom, also asbestos. The scarecrow's entire costume, his whole fit. If you guessed asbestos, fellow conspiracy realist, then ding, ding, you are 3 for 3.
Was that to help fireproof it when they set him on fire? When the witch's broom caught on fire, the scarecrow catches on fire. It was like a very low tech kind of, back then they also didn't have very much safety precautions on film sets. So they were just, it's fine, just spray it with asbestos and we can catch him on fire and it'll be a cool bit.
Yeah, and the Wizard of Oz is its own, carries with it its own bevy of conspiracy baggage from
the makeup on the Tin Man was apparently had aluminum in it or something.
Mm-hmm. And there's an excellent Atlas Obscura article just about the asbestos aspects that uses the Wizard of Oz's name check, but the story goes much deeper than that. And the Pink Floyd thing is true.
Super cool.
Yeah, it is super cool.
Whether it was intentional or not, it is a thing. It is a phenomenon to behold. I highly recommend anyone that's into Pink Floyd try doing the syncing up of Dark Side of the Moon with the Wizard of Oz. You won't be sorry.
And as we're going through this, we're talking about it in a movie set. We're talking about kind of the origins of it, but at the height, this stuff was in absolutely every building constructed, at least within the United States and in many other countries. If it was built essentially from the 1950s onward, let's say until the 1970s, when it was like fully phased out as a construction or a part of construction. But we're talking about ubiquitous, everything. From the roof to the ground, there was asbestos in your stuff.
And it was even being pitched like to consumers, like to individual folks who maybe wanted to do a building project or, do some upgrades on their house. There's this really fantastic ad that we found in a Vice News documentary. It's clearly public domain. If we could play just a couple of seconds of that, it'll give you a sense of how much a part of the zeitgeist at the time asbestos was.
Asbestos is a remarkable mineral, actually stone. It is made up of tiny but extremely strong and flexible fibers. It was absolutely fire safe, and water couldn't harm it. We suggest you consider this material for your home. Designed to last a lifetime, a trouble-free lifetime.
I gotta be honest, I love the way people speak in those ads.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, sometimes they're selling terrible things. But there's just something about the pep in there, It's
quite a bit of pep.
Quite a bit of pep.
I just have to say, living in a house that was built, like right now, where I am, this was built in the 1950s. So we didn't know whether or not our house was built with asbestos or lead paint or any of those things. And I guess we got some documentation, but it just said, we don't know. So
isn't there a lead paint disclosure clause that has to be in like any lease or, home sale? It's like they have to disclose asbestos as well, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes, but there is a place to sign. We're unsure. If further testing needed.
And this is legal. That's a legal situation we're in now. I don't know if it's fair, but that's the law of the land, and that happens. You know what? Actually, depending on where you live, folks, you have probably run into this, and it's something that's easy for a lot of people to miss in their lease paperwork or their, when you're signing a contract for a house, because you have to sign so many things on so many pages. Just read the fine print carefully. By the time, like in this era, this post-World War II era, 50s through the 70s, like Matt, you had just said, it got to a point where it would be highly unusual for you to walk into a large building that did not have some form of asbestos. It would be like finding a vegan restaurant in Eastern Europe. They're there, but you have to look pretty carefully. So far, it sounds like we're talking about something you would hear on a podcast version of This Old House, right? How do I restore my banister with asbestos? But this is a show about critical thinking applied to conspiracies. We said there was a real multi-generational conspiracy afoot here. Why are we talking about it today? It turns out that asbestos has a dark side to its miraculous nature. It may be great at preventing fires, but it's also great at something else, killing human beings. We're going to pause for a word from our sponsor, and then we're diving into the dark waters of a miracle substance. Here's where it gets crazy. There's a huge asbestos cover-up. It's enormous. Think of the biggest cover-up you can imagine. This is bigger. This just mopped it. PvP. You may have already heard about this, but you probably do not know how deep it goes.
Yeah, it's like the big brother, the kind of progenitor to the Teflon, PFA cover-up featuring DuPont that we've covered in previous episodes. I mean, this is like the OG toxic cover-up material.
Oh, yeah. Agreed. I mean, I was surprised to find, we know that there are a lot of modern complaints and lawsuits and laws and controversies about asbestos today, but the first complaints and concerns, like provable health concerns about asbestos, date back to the 1800s, like 1897, 1899. There was a guy named H. Montague Murray who explicitly noted the deleterious health effects of this substance. Shout out to our friends on Facebook. I did pay attention. You are right, and thank you. You'll see this claim that people in the days of ancient Rome may have also had concerns about asbestos and its health effects, but there's not really a primary source to back that up. That's just one of those, that's the definition of a factoid, right? Like, it sounds like it would be true. It sounds factual, but it's not. It's really the late 1800s is when we see the, what I would consider the first modern, let's call them actionable reports of danger here.
Ben, thank you for schooling me. I've been using factoid incorrectly for years. I just thought it was like a cute little fact nugget, but it turns out that it is inherently false, right?
But that's the thing, man. With this language, how ultimately we're all kind of crowdsourcing, right? We're all voting. So if enough people use a word one way, if we all act like Alice in Wonderland's Humpty Dumpty, then it just means what we want. That's how you end up with the beautiful things in English where you have words like peruse, which are their own antonyms, right? Peruse means both to just sort of flip through something, and then it means also to scrutinize every word and read carefully. So I think a factoid can be both things. And if we can convince our fellow conspiracy realists to agree, then we may have just started the biggest, most unnecessary conspiracy of our careers.
Love it. This we've been working towards this whole time, guys.
This whole time.
So the first clearly documented death due to asbestos occurred in 1906. But again, based on how far back we know the stuff was being used widely, surely there were many, many more that preceded it. But we're talking about the 19th century here. It was a long, long time ago. What exactly makes asbestos bad for human beings? And more importantly, why were people not told of these risks if we had that level of like history?
Yeah, the first question is unfortunately pretty easy to answer. Asbestos can cause a number of medical conditions, provable, and a number of certain cancers. And it's not as if it's necessarily always just a contributing factor. In a couple of cases, we'll see that these conditions are almost exclusively caused by asbestos. You know what I mean? Like it's like the Riddler or the Joker leaving a trademark piece of swag at the scene of a crime. It can cause, I'm not trying to be glib, but that is like, if you're a doctor, you can tell there's some conditions that just mean someone ran into asbestos.
I'm sorry, I laughed because I don't know if you guys have seen the new trailer for the Batman movie that's coming out, but the Riddler is a character, and the first thing you see in the trailer is like a spooky like push in at a diner to a latte that has a question mark in it. Like that's the creepy thing he left behind was latte art. I thought that was a really odd choice.
I'm interested to see where they go with the Riddler because they're trying to give him more of a less of a campy vibe.
And I like Paul Dano a lot. Like, you know, he's a excellent actor, and this movie apparently is going to have a lot more, you know, gritty kind of like serial killer vibes. So I'm definitely on board, but I did think it was a little a bit of an odd thing to lead with.
Yeah, agreed. But if you imagine, you know, you're a doctor, and again, we're not giving medical advice. If you see someone that has a condition known as mesothelioma, then you know asbestos was involved. It was the hand behind the trigger. I mean, signs of this condition, this is insidious and enormously unjust. Signs of this condition might not appear until 30 or 40 years after exposure, which means that somebody could be exposed as a kid, or they could have grown up in a mining town. There were hundreds of those in the US. And then not until later in life, maybe 35, 45 years old, all of a sudden they get these kinds of conditions. And we're also talking cancer of the stomach, colorectal, pharynx, and so on.
With mesothelioma in particular, too, you might not see the signs of it for 30 or 40 years, but then it's also the kind of thing that takes a very long time to kill you. And it's very brutal and slow. And, you know, you have to be on oxygen and you just like, you know, short of breath all the time. I think it actually creates fluid in the lungs. So when you see people that have it, their breathing is just the most painful, labored thing you could possibly imagine. It's absolutely heartbreaking. There's a mining town in Montana, Libby, Montana, that has been looked at as like a great example of what long-term asbestos exposure does. And there's several documentaries about it you can find where they interview residents, and many of them that they talk to for the documentaries are doing just that. And it's very hard to watch, but I think an important watch.
And that's not the only problem with breathing that asbestos exposure can cause. There's also this thing where it can scar your lungs. It can physically scar your lungs by breathing in those fibers and the parts that you may not even notice. It's like stuff that's just in the air, and you would just be breathing it, especially if you're working near it. But even if you're living near a place where, let's say, explosions occur in a mine that are trying to get asbestos out. It's called asbestosis, and it is another one of those horrible things where you're just going to be dealing with it because that's what your life is now. You have scarred lungs, and it's way harder for you to breathe.
And you can't unscar the lungs.
Exactly. One of the things that makes asbestos such a, you know, a resilient building material is the idea that it's very hard to destroy. That's also true once it gets into your body, you know?
Yeah. And these fibers on an individual level are microscopic. They are invisible to the unaided eye, which means that if you are walking through an area contaminated with this, you are not going to notice. You are just going to be breathing as normal until you're not. There's another non-cancerous lung condition it causes called pleural disease, which involves damage to the membrane known as the pleura that surrounds the lung and chest cavities. And this is what we're listing here, folks. This is not a list of just potential problems. Even today, right now, 2021, asbestos exposure is believed to be the number one cause of work-related deaths in the world. And I haven't seen a Dangerous Jobs about that on Discovery. But like approximately 90,000 people are going to die from an asbestos-related disease this year. And right now, an estimated 125 million people remain at risk of regular occupational exposure to asbestos. These are estimates, but these are not necessarily estimates that are up for debate. People have done the homework. You know, the subreddit for this would be like, they did the math or something like that. Asbestos is still such a dangerous thing because it was embedded in so much of the world's construction for such a long time, but also because the nature of the damage it does means that people will live with it for a long time without knowing that damage has occurred. And a lot of people were involved in the industry. Asbestos mining was huge. You know, we said there were like hundreds of mining towns. There were more than 100 operating mines in the U.S. alone from like the 60s and the early 70s when it reached its height. The industry was growing as awareness of the dangers were growing. They were happening at the same time, which is kind of unusual.
It makes sense why there would be a cover-up if those two things are true, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it's profitable, and it was easy to get right out of the ground, you know, in these mining towns. And you ended up with situations where the one town, like Libby, for example, was built around this industry. And even if as the people there maybe are starting to worry or be concerned, they also don't want to lose their livelihood. I mean, we know how some of these smaller kind of rural towns, if an industry goes belly up, so does the town. So it's a weird kind of double-edged sword where they're like, ooh, maybe this is really bad for us, but also we don't really want to lose our one industry. So maybe we'll keep our mouths shut about this condition that we might have developed.
Yeah. And that goes to local level and state level officials. That also, you know, if anybody's lived in a one industry town, you know that every job ultimately relies upon that industry. Even if you're, you know, like you're the family that runs the local diner, you've never been in a coal mine, but if the coal mine closes, then the diner isn't far off from closing as well. And Matt, you set us up earlier when you talked about open pit mining, which was the primary technique for mining asbestos in the U.S. and also across the planet. Let's maybe talk a little bit about this. What was open pit mining? What makes it different from other types of mining?
You've probably seen pictures of a mine like this before. It almost looks like tiered like roads that go around almost in an inverted pyramid style, right? They kind of go down towards the lowest level like that. The way to get the asbestos out in a mining situation like this is to plant explosives in one section that would, if you imagine it going all across a very long section, and then you'd explode what exists there, then you'd gather all of that up, all of that rock and, you know, dirt and everything that's in there, and you'd basically get the asbestos and the usable substances and minerals out from that stuff you exploded out from the major rock structure.
Yeah, and as you can tell, when those explosions occur, this also fractures or, you know, splinters the asbestos, and you have tiny microscopic pieces of contaminant that are in the air and unavoidable without protection. This isn't something where you can just hold your breath. You know what I mean?
Not only that, I mean, it's similar to the way radioactive materials are carried, you know, fallout zones, et cetera. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but this material being so durable, it just kind of goes to the surrounding areas on the wind and then ends up in the water supply and all manner of other ways that people can absorb it. The clothing of the miners, say, for example, even like, children or the family members, even if they're not directly breathing the stuff in from the explosion, they might be subjected to it when their family member comes home and the stuff's all over their clothes.
Yeah, it's important to note that when it becomes aerosolized like that, it really does get everywhere, including the sand and stones and rocks on beaches and, around waterfronts, on the water itself, on the plant life, on the animals. It gets everywhere because it's traveling through the air, like this unseen mist that's just permeating everything.
Yeah, forget communism. There's another invisible enemy in America at this time, right? People were also beginning to understand that asbestos may not be quite the miracle manufacturers were telling them it was. By the 1920s, medical journals in this country had already published articles linking asbestos to asbestosis, which, again, if a disease or condition is named after a substance,
after the thing.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say, oh, no, we didn't know. There are only so many letters in the alphabet. Whatever.
We'll get to it later, too. But another place that was named after the thing is a mining town in Russia called Asbest, because they're really proud of their asbestos mining industry that is, unfortunately, I believe, still going on today.
Yeah, with a huge monument actually carved of asbestos and everything. Yeah, asbestosis is this fatal lung condition, like you guys were saying, where it scars the human breathing mechanism. Doctors, again, back in the 20s, in the 1930s, they were saying, probably the best way to prevent this condition, the scarring of the lungs, is to, limit people's exposure to asbestos. That seems pretty conclusive. Nobody was disagreeing. This wasn't a matter of serious debate amid those in the medical community, but it would still take decades and decades before this stuff was regulated in the U.S. and decades before workers were ever told that their jobs were giving them cancer. So this leads us to another question. Why the gap in information? Why was it still used so widely, and why is it even being used today? These are questions we'll tackle after a word from our sponsors. We've returned. So how about that second question? We've answered why and how asbestos is bad for humans. Why wasn't the public aware of these risks? There's no way around this, folks. Scientists had clearly linked asbestos to cancer right around the 1930s, right around the same time doctors made real progress in understanding mesothelioma. And some of the progress they made was figuring out, oh, hey, this is pretty much only caused by asbestos. Like the vast majority of these cases are from people who have been exposed to this one substance. And at the same time this evidence began to grow, the influence of very powerful asbestos companies grew as well. Like, make no mistake, you don't maybe hear about them too often in the news, but mining companies are a big deal. They have a lot of political clout in various countries, and they have a lot of financial power because people are hooked on what they provide from the earth or what they take from the earth.
You're literally pulling money out of the ground.
Hashtag Black Monday murders. Over the course of 4 decades, if you look at the period from the 1940s to the 1980s, this group, I don't want to call them a cabal, but this group of manufacturers in the asbestos industry, they grew their business into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They employed hundreds of thousands of people, and they knew good and damn well that their success depended upon keeping the problems with asbestos a secret for as long as possible. Not a conspiracy theory, actual conspiracy. They conspired. They did it. You can see a solid timeline for this on asbestos.com. There is one problem, though, or not problem, but there's a thing you should know about asbestos.com. It is a for-profit entity. It is there to help you file legal claims for asbestos-related conditions. Still, looking into their research and what they've gathered, even though, of course, you know, they would be a biased source, their research is sound. They know what they're talking about. If you look at their timeline, which is available for free online, it starts around 1858 with the founding of Johns Manville, an asbestos manufacturer that will go on to become the top dog in the world in this thing. And therefore, they were on the front lines of the cover-up.
Yeah, it really is devastating to actually look at the entire timeline that they've got there at asbestos.com. I would say it's very strange to me that within their timeline, they jump from 1949 to 1962, and there's nothing in the 1950s. And one of the main reasons is because the 1950s was boom time for putting asbestos in things. It was like, let's go, boys, get that asbestos in there as quick as we can, I guess. And nobody was worried about, anything else.
Well, let's not forget, too, Ben, you mentioned that the town of Asbest in Russia has a sculpture made out of asbestos. So this really was a super versatile material. Like, if you look at some of these documentaries we're talking about, you'll see people showing you little artifacts and little trinkets made of asbestos and handling them like it's no big deal.
Yep, exactly. Kind of the same way people would drink out a leaded glass with no worries. You know what I mean? We see that this timeline, as you guys mentioned, it's uneven. It has some gaps, but it does generally map out in detail actions by various leaders of industry to suppress the information, to keep it from the public. And they were at this for a very long time. And back in 1929, a group of asbestos manufacturers contacted a guy named Dr. Anthony Lanza, who was a medical director at Metropolitan Life Insurance, which we'll get to in a second, asked them to investigate disease among asbestos factory workers. And he came back and he said, hey, these guys all show incredibly high rates of asbestos-related diseases. And they were like, cool, thanks for playing, Doc. And then they buried his results. They suppressed it. They probably had him sign something agreeing that he wouldn't talk about this. Metropolitan Life Insurance would go on to actively participate in the cover-up to help swindle employees out of medical care, to deny their claims, and so on. They also manipulated studies to downplay the seriousness of some conditions. Over across the pond in the UK, a manufacturer called Turner and Noel convinced bribed British officials to limit regulations and dial back any safety inspections. It wasn't until 1964 or so that the tide started turning. And that is sadly because a lot of people saw someone they knew die or be afflicted with some mysterious lung condition. And word on the street, everybody in a given region knew, if you live near this mine, if you live in this town, you have a much higher likelihood of not just getting a cancer or a kind of cancer, but a short list of very specific ones. And so this is when asbestos manufacturers did what corporate America calls a pivot. They got out in public and they said, we're as surprised as you. We had no idea. And some people believed them, and maybe they were convincing. But later, internal memos from these companies talking with themselves, like multiple companies conspiring, and court paperwork, depositions, they all proved this was a lie. There's one Bendix Corporation employee from 1966 who wrote, if you've enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to laugh. It's just
it's terrible.
It's brilliant copywriting is what it is. But it's also inherently nihilistic and missing the point, kind of, One of the experts in one of the documentaries I watched, I think it was the Vice one, said how at this scale, If a company knows what they're putting out in the world is going to kill you, then they are committing mass murder. They may not know who it's going to kill or when it's going to kill them, but if they're, maintaining that level of negligence, in favor of profit over, human rights, then they are in fact mass murderers.
Well, let's talk about the Bendix concept really quickly, the one that you just mentioned there, Ben, with regards to all of this. Imagine that you are working for a company and you've been working there for a long time. You've been making pretty good money. You've been supporting, let's say, your family, right? And you're continuing to make pretty good money. You find out that by working there, by exposure to whatever chemical you're dealing with, you are likely going to die at some point from a disease it's going to cause inside of you. And if you're informed of that information, you can make the decision to continue working there, to continue to support your family until you do eventually die. And that is one thing for me. That's one decision, right? What if you find out that you're not the only one that's going to die in your family because you're doing that maybe everybody in your family is going to be exposed to the same stuff because they're using the products. It's not just the manufacturing process, it's also the use of the product. Like that to me is a whole different, it's just
level
a whole
of
different
ethical quandary.
Yes.
But wasn't it not until like the 2000s even that like the World Health Organization actually made a stand on this, or that it was, really kind of considered verboten? Because I have distinct memory of going to this high school. I've mentioned this before, where it was an old building and we got a new school, brand new shiny school, and everyone, moved to the new school. But the old school was known to be an asbestos hazard. And there was all of this like efforts to do this asbestos removal. So this wouldn't have been in the 2000s. This was probably in like the mid 90s. So when did the public consciousness really shift and like cancel asbestos in the United States, Ben?
In the United States, the first lawsuits date back to 1971. Which is still almost a century after those concerns were first raised. And court evidence has gone on to show that multiple companies contributed knowingly to this. Some had, like we said, buried research. Others had kept information from their employees, like to the point where you'd have to see the company doctor. And the company doctor wouldn't show you your x-rays. And you would just be... They would just have you continue working as normal until you died or were physically unable, to breathe well enough to work the mine.
Okay, so it was 1978 when the United States officially banned asbestos. But because it had been used for so long, that means that all of these homes were just chock full of asbestos, like my high school. And so then asbestos removal became a whole industry. And I think off air, Ben, you were mentioning how it's like one of the least regulated, like, any schmuck can like be an asbestos removal technician. And I mentioned that in The Sopranos, there was a subplot where they were running a racket for asbestos removal because, the idea would be, remove it from the place, but then you got to do something with it so it's not further contaminating, other people's water supplies or whatever. It needs to be dealt with in some sort of, particular way. But in the show, they just dumped it into like the East River. Isn't it interesting though, how like, science kind of creates a thing that is then used, and then science has to create a solution. And it's also wrapped up in industry and just money making. And so corners get cut, and we're probably still dealing with the fallout from asbestos today.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we look back at this timeline, we know that once Johns Manville became the number one manufacturer of this substance, we can actually do something I usually don't like to do, which is to put a face on a nefarious corporate activity. But we'll give you a single person to think about. His name is Louis H. Brown. The scientific term for him would be a real piece of shit. In 1984, there was this deposition where these different attorneys and officials were describing a meeting that had occurred between Louis H. Brown, an attorney for Johns Manville called Van Diver Brown, no relation, I believe, and officials from another firm making asbestos called Unarco. And this guy, Charles Romer, is talking this deposition, and he recalls interchange Lewis Brown had about his employees' health. And he says, quote, "I'll never forget. I turned to Mr. Brown. One of the Browns made this crack that UNARCO managers were a bunch of fools for notifying employees who had asbestosis. And I said, 'Mr. Brown, do you mean to tell me that you would let them work until they drop dead?' He said, 'Yeah, we save a lot of money that way.'"
Ooh.
Just straight out said it, you know?
In a deposition?
No, the Romer is saying this in a deposition. Brown's not there. No, I don't think he had quite that level of chutzpah.
Okay, I'm not even going to take it back because I was confused because the level of chutzpah this guy had almost would be the kind of thing where he'd be like, "Yeah, I did it. Of course. You know, what else was I going to do? We got to make money."
Ask the shareholders.
Yeah. What am I going to be, poor? I'm going to be a poor?
I swear, if I have to go from being super rich to just rich, I'm going to kill myself.
And he's
That's
like, yeah.
Mr. Show.
And he's like, "Your Honor, I dismiss this case." And the judge is like, "That's not how courts work, bro.
You don't get that luxury." So this is really just kind of like, you know, Ben, to your point, kind of like a little bit of a snapshot of how callous some of the people at the top were. They knew people were dying. They absolutely didn't care. When the public outcry led to all of these lawsuits, the government finally did take action and impose regulations. And like I said, in 1978, the stuff was outright banned. And now when we think of asbestos, what do we think of? We think of the bad stuff. We think of it's the stuff, this legacy stuff that was in everything and now is like a boondoggle on our, you know, public health. Asbestos removal continues to this day. Yeah. It is still, because there's so many buildings. Think, you know, we can't really understate how ubiquitous this stuff was. It's like if all of a sudden a toilet became a toxic thing, just the concept of the toilet. I was in New York recently on vacation. I was like, for some reason, because I do dumb things like this, I was like, I wonder how many toilets there are in New York City. It's a lot. It's going to be a lot. And with asbestos, it's not even only in one product. It's in all of these building materials. So the idea of asbestos removal is a generational concept, you know? I mean, they're going to keep doing it.
Wouldn't it be funny if Johns Manville was the number one worldwide asbestos removal corporation in 2022?
Ooh.
That's a pivot. That's a serious. Yeah. Let's go from like
capitalism.
Yeah. We infected everyone. We exposed everyone to asbestos, and now we see the error of our ways. And also, it happened to align with a real good money making scheme of removing the asbestos that we put into the world.
I mean, well, good advertising is always about creating a need instead of identifying it. And we do want to point out, you know, like for example, when I said at the top that people, you were probably personally infected by this in some way. Just for an example from our own lives, the building in which our office is based, Ponce City Market, had to get a deep clean to remove lead-based paint and asbestos. And I do want to say the people who are working in the asbestos removal industry right now are doing a good thing, and it's not easy, and it is dangerous, and it's not really an operation with an end in sight because there's so much there. In a very real way, the current generations are paying for the mistakes of generations past, and other companies definitely helped with this. There are still lawsuits continuing. If we look at asbestos today, right now, like in this year, asbestos will kill 12,000 to 15,000 people in the U.S. alone. Oh, people in Johns Manville, by the way, pulled a Sackler. They didn't go to jail. You don't go to jail when you're at that level. They never
do. No, you don't. And just to answer a question that I asked a while ago, like when you do dispose of asbestos, it's not like it's disappearing. The whole point of this stuff was like plastics and microplastics or whatever. It doesn't really decay. It doesn't biodegrade. So they really just have to like seal it in containers, sort of like nuclear waste, and then put it in an asbestos disposal site, which essentially, I guess at that point becomes a Superfund site, or it's like a toxic hazardous waste disposal thing like Yucca Mountain or something, you know?
Mm-hmm. So make no mistake, this is a genuine multi-generational conspiracy of the most common and disappointing sort. There's nothing occult going on here. There's no weird spiritual thing. It's just people who had money and wanted more money and didn't care about who died as a result.
This is the quintessential conspiracy. This is the Occam's razor of conspiracies. We don't need there to be some spooky ulterior motive. It just makes sense. Oh, there's a thing that people want to buy that we can sell for a long time. Oh, it kills them a little bit. It's fine. They won't figure that out for a while. Let's just keep draining them of their cash for as long as possible. And then when the public outcry becomes large enough, we'll pivot and then be like, oops, sorry. And then we're fine.
We're as surprised as you are. And this, by the way, this is not ancient history. As we had mentioned before, while there are no active asbestos mines here in the U.S. where we record this show, there are plenty of asbestos mines around the world now, especially as we foreshadowed, in Russia. Noel, you and Matt and I watched that Vice documentary we mentioned several times. Where you can also see some pretty harrowing studies about what's going on there. But asbestos manufacturing, open pit mining of asbestos, is alive and well with our neighbors in Russia.
Well, I mentioned that they are so proud of it. Again, there's a term I learned in that Vice documentary. It's called a monotown, which we have these in the United States as well. When the housing market collapsed, a lot of places in the Midwest and even here in the South that exclusively existed to do, say, carpet manufacturing or certain things that were specifically for housing or construction, they just absolutely their unemployment rates were near 100%. And in Russia it is the same, but it's not even regulated. None of this stuff is regulated because it's all at the behest of Putin. They really don't care about human rights or public health exactly in the same way. Maybe there's a calculus they do to make sure that their whole population doesn't die out. It reminds me a lot of what happened with Chernobyl, where there was this absolute public health catastrophe that took place, but they didn't announce it for a long time, a very long time, the amount of time that led to a huge amount of people getting exposed to radioactive fallout. And if you've seen the Chernobyl, miniseries on HBO or read much about it, you understand that it becomes this almost 1984 kind of mentality where it's we don't make mistakes. So if something went wrong, it didn't really go wrong. You know what I mean?
Right. It would be, there's a really good look at this when we see Stalin era stories where, I recently watched a film that was kind of a critical bomb, but it had Tom Hardy and Gary Oldman in it. And it's about attempting to find a serial killer in the USSR. And the whole problem is that Stalin has decreed murder as a capitalist crime. So they're not allowed to investigate homicides because they don't exist. Right. Exactly. And this is very, very dangerous. Yeah. And we know that people have been trying to get asbestos out, to get the message out. And industries have been also, in their defense, they've been working to limit asbestos use and, asbestos removal, as you said, is an industry all its own. But I found this really interesting quote from a guy named Jock McCullough, and he said the following: "The industry's survival has been largely due to its success in keeping alive the fiction that asbestos can be used safely. Arguably, its most potent weapons have been the suppression of evidence about the hazards of asbestos and even the corruption of science aimed to promote doubt about the mineral's toxicity." This interview is not from the 1960s. Matt, Noel, this interview is from 2006. The problem is real. The problem is huge. It is still here. And at this point, we said this episode was going to be a bummer. Here's why. First, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have died. More will die this year and the year after that. But secondly, there's not really a clear, easy solution. There's not a way to undo the consequences of this conspiracy. No, I would even say at this point, we pass the torch to our fellow conspiracy realists. We want to hear what you think. I would not be surprised if we have friends in the audience today who themselves work in some branch of the asbestos removal industry, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know anybody personally, but it absolutely is a thing that continues to be one of those dirty jobs they talk about. But this is probably not one that they really have done an episode on because it is so heavy. And it is an example of like, oh, no one else will do this job. Well, I'll do it. It probably pays a decent hourly wage, but at what cost? At least here, I mean, when in that documentary on Vice, when they're in the town of Asbestos, they talk to people that work at the mines, and they don't wear any protective gear. They borderline don't even acknowledge the dangers of the stuff. And then there's a few scientists that they interviewed, from Russia, who are like the most telling one was there's a scientist who is actually contracted by the World Health Organization to do research on asbestos effects in the town of Asbestos. And the vice journalist point blank just said, so there's people in this town that live near an open pit mine, an open asbestos pit mine. Is asbestos dangerous? And this like super cool, calculated, like company man Russian scientist says, well, life is dangerous. I mean, that's about as dismissive as you can get.
Yeah, it's definitely an answer to a different question. Russia is by far the world's largest producer of asbestos today. In like any way you look at it, the second place would be Kazakhstan. Russia makes 790,000 metric tons. Kazakhstan makes 210,000 metric tons. At least that's what they did last year. Mm-hmm. And the numbers don't seem set to go down anytime soon because industries still use this stuff. So at this point, folks, we've laid out the case. We want to hear from you. What is to be done? What should be done? What's your take? And then are there stories of other substances like asbestos that have been the subject of multi-generational conspiracies, corruption, and cover-ups? Let us know. We try to be easy to find online.
Oh, the internet. We're on it. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube, most importantly, under the handle Conspiracy Stuff. Check out the YouTube channel. We do polls of every one of these episodes that we do, usually a cool little 10-minute clip. And then if you don't want to listen to the whole episode, check that out. But usually it'll make you want to listen to the whole episode. You can also find us on Instagram, where we are the handle at Conspiracy Stuff Show. You can also find us as individual people. I am at How Now Noel Brown on Instagram. How about you, bud?
You can get a look backstage at the research I'm doing in my various misadventures at Ben Bolin, HSW on Twitter, at Ben Bolin on Instagram, BOWLIN. Good pal Matt has become a conscientious objector to social media.
I fully support him. I fully support him in this endeavor.
Yeah, so out of respect for him, we'll leave it to him to maybe share his social media at a later date. For now, if you don't particularly sip the social meds, never fear. There's another way you can contact us. We have a phone number.
It is 1-833-STDWYTK. Leave a message at the sound of Ben's dulcet tones. 3 minutes is the time you will have to tell your tale. Let us know what to call you, give yourself a cool nickname, or tell us not to call you anything. And to anonymize you completely, we will absolutely do that. And you might hear yourself on one of our weekly listener mail episodes. And if that is not your bag, you can reach out to us the good old-fashioned way with an email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.